Today we have a story that takes us back to one of the boldest raids of the Civil War. It's a tale of stolen trains, high-speed chases, and desperate acts of sabotage. We're talking about the Great Locomotive Chase, also known as Andrews Raid. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is another one of the stories of Appalachia.
Did I hear you correctly, Steve? Sabotage? I thought it was pronounced sabotage.
No, it's sabotage, or sabotage, if you want to say it that way.
Okay.
And speaking of that, do you know the origin of the term sabotage?
Yes, I do. It was when those poor oppressed workers flung their wooden shoes known as sabot into the machinery, hence the term sabotage.
Very good. You get an A today.
Yeah, that just goes to show you can learn something from watching Star Trek, okay?
Okay. I don't know the connection, but I'll take your word for it.
I can tell you what it was. Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. It was just they used that a line in the movie. Valeris uses it. And that's when the word comes out about sabotage and the term sabotage, where it came from. So I thought I'd throw that in.
Okay. Well, this story, folks, doesn't have anything to do with Star Trek, starships, spaceships, space, or anything like that. This is a Civil War story that happened in Appalachia. And we've had several folks get in touch with us and say, hey, can you do a story from North Georgia? And so we figured this one probably would fit the bill. So, Rod, you ready to get into this?
I sure am. This is a very, very exciting story, but you'll find out the more we go through this.
Indeed. And to get this story started, we're going to tell you a little bit about a fellow named James J. Andrews. Now, Mr. Andrews was a skilled merchant and trader from Kentucky. By the time the Civil War broke out, he had established himself in business in his home state and in the neighboring state of Tennessee. He was successful and well respected, but, as is often the case, there was more to Mr. Andrews than met the eye. You see, Andrews had a bit of a reputation as a man who could slip through enemy lines unnoticed because of his reputation as a trader, and that reputation made him valuable to the country he loved, the United States. Although he wasn't a regular spy, Andrews often worked as a scout and secret agent for the Union, especially in Tennessee. He had a knack for gathering valuable information, and his ability to blend in with both Union and Confederate supporters made him perfect for those kind of missions.
So for short, we have ourselves a Union version of a James Bond, so to speak, able to slip in behind enemy lines and be who he has to be and everything. But in fact, by 1862, Andrews had already proven himself useful to the Union Army by helping to smuggle medicine and supplies to Union soldiers trapped behind enemy lines in Tennessee. His extensive knowledge of the area and the Confederate rail system caught the attention of Union generals, particularly Major General Ormsby Mitchell, who was in command of Union forces in Tennessee at the time. Mitchell was looking for a way to push deeper into Confederate territory, particularly interested in how to take Chattanooga, which was a key rail hub for the South. Andrews stepped forward with a daring plan: steal a Confederate train in Georgia, destroy the railway lines leading up to Chattanooga, preventing the Confederates from reinforcing the city. According to Andrews, there was a sympathetic engineer that was willing to operate the train, and then he would defect over to the Union side. Well, it was a bold plan, to say the least, and General Mitchell gave Andrews the green light. Now, to pull this off, Andrews needed a team. He gathered volunteers from Mitchell's division at Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and in March 1862, they started south to the Confederate railhead at Tullahoma, where they caught a train to, of all places, Marietta, Georgia.
But Rod, when they got to Marietta, they discovered the engineer who was supposed to help them had been reassigned elsewhere.
Uh-oh.
Yes, indeed. Andrews asked his volunteers if any of them had any experience with operating a locomotive, which, of course, none of them had. With no one to drive the train, Andrews had no choice but to call the operation off and return to Murfreesboro, along with 2 raiders who'd been caught trying to cut telegraph lines but who had managed to escape capture by fooling the rebel soldiers they were just overworked wiremen. Well, that first failed attempt didn't stop Andrews. A few weeks later, he planned another raid, and since the men who went with him in March had declined to return due to a feeling that they were marching to certain death in Confederate territory, this time he organized a larger group of raiders drawn from 3 Ohio regiments, the 2nd, the 21st, and the 33rd Ohio Infantry. By April 11, 1862, after a one-day delay due to bad weather, Andrews and his raiders arrived in Marietta, traveling in small groups and dressed like civilians to avoid suspicion. The plan was to steal a train on its way to Chattanooga, destroying track, bridges, and telegraph lines on the way.
So here's our setting. The morning of April 12th, a train pulled by a locomotive dubbed the General made its way and its scheduled stop at Big Shanty. What a name. Now known as Kennesaw, and so the passengers and crew could depart, get breakfast at the Lacey Hotel, and then be ready to go on their way. Well, Andrews and his men had come to Big Shanty to steal a train because they thought that this stop didn't have a telegraph office, so getting word out about the train hijacking would be delayed. This was the moment that James Andrews had been waiting for. Andrews and his men made their move. They uncoupled the passenger cars, took control of the General, and they headed north. All appeared to be going as planned, until it didn't. While the raiders were speeding away on the General, thinking that they were in the clear, the train's conductor, William A. Fuller, realized, "My train's been stolen." Well, without missing a beat, Fuller, along with 2 of his other men, started chasing the stolen train on foot. Yes, you heard me correctly, on foot. He wasn't about to let his train go without a fight.
And as you'll see, folks, Mr. Fuller plays a big role in this whole escapade that we're talking about. Fuller and his crew ran after the train, eventually hopping onto a handcar and later commandeering another locomotive. Fuller was relentless. He was not about to let Andrews and his men get away, and he stayed right on their tail. Andrews' raiders, meanwhile, were having problems of their own. Having taken a regularly scheduled train, they realized they'd have to follow that train's schedule to avoid arousing suspicion. So that led to delays as they encountered southbound trains and station masters intent on following procedures that slowed the raiders down. He eventually concocted a story that Confederate General Beauregard had ordered the train sent to Chattanooga to help with the defense of the city, and that, along with the cutting of telegraph wires, was enough to get past those station masters. The southbound trains, though, were a different matter. See, there were several southbound freight trains coming, evacuating Chattanooga in anticipation of a major battle for the city. At Kingston, Andrews was delayed for over an hour to allow southbound traffic to pass before he could go on towards Chattanooga, allowing conductor Fuller to just about catch up to him.
You notice we were talking about, cutting down, chopping down telegraph wires and things like that, burning bridges. There's all a point to this, which we'll talk about here a little bit later on. But while Fuller was gaining on them, Andrews' plan started to fall apart. First, the rain slowed them down. They had trouble burning the bridges they'd planned to destroy, and they didn't have the proper tools to tear up the tracks as quickly as they needed to. Every delay gave Fuller that much more time to be able to catch up. At Kingston, Fuller switched to another locomotive, the William R. Smith, and continued the chase. 2 miles south of Adairsville, though, the Smith was stopped by a broken rail caused by Andrews' raiders, forcing him to abandon the locomotive for another one north of that break. Well, the one that he abandoned for was the Texas, which William Fuller commandeered for the chase. And the Texas, though, well, it wasn't headed north, it was headed south. No problem. Fuller then took the locomotive and he headed north, in reverse, picking up 11 Confederate soldiers at Calhoun as they chased James Andrews and the general. Well, by this time, Andrews and his men realized they couldn't shake Fuller. They were low on fuel, and they were still 18 miles from Chattanooga. They had no choice but to abandon the general at Ringgold, Georgia, and scatter into the woods, but they wouldn't get far.
Running a locomotive backwards in North Georgia.
It's
chasing
possible.
These guys.
It's possible.
Wow. Well, they did not get far, Rod. Within 2 weeks, every one of Andrews' men had been captured. The Confederates charged them with, quote, acts of unlawful belligerency, end quote, and because they'd been dressed as civilians instead of soldiers, most of them were tried as spies. James Andrews was the first to be executed. He was hanged in Atlanta on June 7, 1862. 7 more of his raiders met the same fate shortly thereafter. On June 18th, those 7 were executed by hanging and buried in unmarked graves. They were later reburied in Chattanooga National Cemetery after the war. It was a brutal end to a daring mission. Now, some of the raiders did manage to escape and make their way back the Union lines, including 2 men who floated down the Chattahoochee River to the Gulf of Mexico, where the Union blockade ship USS Somerset picked them up. The men who survived imprisonment were exchanged for Confederate prisoners on March 17, 1863, and were treated as heroes. In fact, Rod, they were the first recipients of the Medal of Honor, the highest military award in the United States. But, unfortunately, since Andrews was not in the military, but was a civilian, he was not eligible for that award.
Well, the legacy of the Great Locomotive Chase also lives on. William Pittenger, one of the raiders who survived, wrote a memoir called Daring and Suffering, which became the basis for several films, one in which was the 1956 Disney movie, The Great Locomotive Chase.
And, Rod, I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. I kind of barely remember it from when I was a kid. I think it may have been on The Wonderful World of Disney, that they used to have on TV. But I don't remember the details on it. But
Right.
The locomotives themselves, folks, have been preserved. The General is displayed at the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History in Kennesaw, Georgia, and the Texas is housed at the Atlanta History Center. And these pieces of history have survived, and they're still around for us to see. And if you get a chance and want to go do so, head on down to Georgia and check that out.
You know, Steve, we mentioned, or at least I mentioned earlier in the podcast, we were talking a little bit about burning bridges, tearing down telegraph wires, and so forth. That was just a part of, I guess, military, especially back in the Civil War days, but that's a common part of destroying what? Infrastructure, at least, or making it rougher on the Army or whatever to be able to depend on communications and other things. This was like a prelude to Sherman's March to the Sea, wasn't it?
It was a prelude for that. They were just trying to slow everybody down from the Confederacy so they could take Chattanooga, and then they could march on to Atlanta, and then Sherman could do his infamous march to the sea, burning everything that he happened to come across as he went. It's a really big part of Appalachian history. Well, folks, that is the story of the Great Locomotive Chase, another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to the Stories Podcast, give us a like, and leave us a comment if you don't mind. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.